I think any discussion about the future of pensions in Ireland without reference to sovereign annuities would be a bit like a performance of Hamlet without the prince. So what I tend to do this morning is introduce you to this princely character. And the question is, who is he? Some would have us believe that he is a knight in shining armour, a prince charming, here to rescue the struggling Irish pension fund. Others would have us believe that he is a dark prince, here to torment trustees with impossible decisions and to bring insecurity to pensioners in their old age. I'll intend to present the evidence to you, and you will be the jury. At the end, you will have to make up your own mind. The agenda I tend to follow today is something of the past, the present, and the future. I'll look back at the origin of sovereign annuities, how they originated, why they were first proposed. Then I'll look at the present, at the current Irish Life sovereign annuity product, which we have ready to send to the Pensions Board for certification. And then we'll look at the future. How will sovereign annuities actually be used by trustees and pensioners? What type of decisions will they make, and under what sort of circumstances? It's useful always to look back and to see why it is that an idea first germinated. What was the spark that caused it to come into existence? Sovereign annuities were first proposed during 2010, and it was in December 2010 that then Minister O'Keefe made available sovereign annuities, and regulations then followed later on. The origin for them, as David has mentioned, is because Irish pension funds, when they come to assessing their solvency, use market annuity rates. Because insurance companies are prudent organisations, and because insurance companies are fully on the hook for annuities, regardless of how the actual underlying assets perform, insurance companies have tended to price annuities and back annuities with quite conservative assets. These assets, being conservative, obviously won't return very high amounts on an annual basis because of the level of security associated with them. This meant that annuities were generally regarded as being expensive. At the time, however, Irish bond yields or Irish government returns were considerably higher than those available on these ultra-conservative assets. And the idea germinated via the IAPF, Society of Actuaries, and others within the industry that could it be possible to link annuities to Irish bond yields. And this was one of the ideas, motivations behind sovereign annuities. It was seen potentially as a magic silver bullet that could solve the Irish funding pension problem. A secondary reason behind sovereign annuities, which made it quite a win-win attractive proposition for the government, was the fact that the Irish state got very little investment from Irish pension funds. At the time, figures were released showing that less than 5% of the assets of Irish pension funds were actually invested in Irish government debt. By standards of other countries, this was an extremely low level of investment, and it meant that the cost of funding for the Irish state and the stability of that cost was a lot less attractive than it would be for other governments. The UK government, for instance, has quite a good, strong local demand for its skills. So the idea was that if sovereign annuities could be developed, that the Irish pension funds and the insurance companies through annuities and bonds would create a strong local demand for Irish government debt, which would reduce the burden of the country of funding that debt. A third reason behind the development of sovereign annuities, which David has mentioned previously, is that effectively it becomes a quick and easy way to change the priority rules. The current priority rules are generally considered to be somewhat unfair on the actives and deferreds. David made reference to people queuing up at a petrol station. And the current reality is that pensioners can queue up at the petrol station, they can fill their tank with Super Premium Plus unleaded, while those at the back of the queue potentially end up having their engines run dry. Sovereign annuities propose a fairer distribution of those pension fund assets in the event of wind up under a deficit situation. Now you might fairly ask the question, why is it taking so long for sovereign annuities to be developed? And like anything else, the devil really is in the detail. Pension fund regulation, as we know, is quite complicated, and so is life office regulation. When you try and mesh the two of them together, you naturally come up with some challenges. One of the challenges behind sovereign annuities was that the Pensions Board, quite rightly and reasonably, wanted maximum level of clarity for pensioners, that in the event that there was a restructuring event or a default, that those pensioners would have certainty as to how their pension would be adjusted. However, life offices, looking in particular at the Greek situation and the unfolding drama, were quite wary of the complexity that this would present, and felt that if they committed to strong guarantees in relation to any type of default, that they could have laws of unintended consequences, and that with replication of any type of Greek situation could cause life companies significant exposures. However, we've been working through these issues with the Pensions Board, and we've now come to a resolution on them, which will be reflected shortly in the policy that we will be issuing. So how will sovereign annuities actually work? Just for some of the people who aren't familiar with the core concepts of it, what each sovereign annuity will be is linked to EU state reference bonds. So this can be any state within the European Union that insurers have the ability to reference the bond to. In the event then that the bonds do not perform as expected, that they do not actually pay out all the scheduled payments, the insurer has the ability to adjust the pensions. This is the crucial difference between sovereign annuities and conventional annuities. With conventional annuities, the insurer is fully liable for the payments regardless of how the underlying asset backing performs. With the sovereign annuity, the insurer can be somewhat more relaxed and neutral as regards the level of risk under the investment, because that risk is being passed through to the policyholder. The way in which it can be passed through the policyholder is either by an immediate reduction of their pension in that particular year, or by a smoothing forward of that reduction into the future over the lifetime of the person. So Irish Life have considered the different offerings available in the marketplace, and we're happy to announce what it is that we will be proposing to the market in the very near future. This will evolve over time. It's not going to be set in stone. Naturally, the market and trustees and employer demands will change, but also the investment markets do change over time. Our initial offering will be to offer sovereign annuities linked to Irish government debt and to French government debt. The Irish government debt proposal is hinged upon the NTMA releasing what are known as amortising bonds. To put that another way, amortising bonds are also known as zero coupon bonds. They're bonds which have a flat income stream throughout their duration, unlike traditional bonds which have a low level of income and then a large lump sum payment at the end. So these are flatter, longer bonds. The advantage of these to Irish Life is we can use them to match our annuity payments very exactly, and they become a natural fit for matching annuity offerings. Now, France already has, to use some technical jargon, the full duration yield curve. This means essentially France already has these long, flat bonds available, and it's possible for us to construct a portfolio which matches out annuity liabilities using France at the moment. Other technical rules means that other countries don't yet have these type of bonds, and they don't have the level of duration of the French or of the new Irish market. So as a result, we'll be restricted and unable to make other bonds available. However, this will change over time because governments do issue new types of debts, and will remain completely awake to the possibility of offering alternative offerings. Now, trustees may initially think that this is quite a restrictive set of choice. They only have two types of sovereign annuities to work with. Is that a very limited level of offering to propose to them? Well, I'm going to talk now a little bit about how trustees can actually flex within these options and to ensure that they come up with a type of risk profile for the sovereign annuities that they're happy with. Firstly, it's worth noting that with the Irish Life offering, trustees will have the ability to mix and match between the different types of sovereign annuities and between conventional annuities. And this gives the trustees the ability to come up with the right risk-return profile that they see as being appropriate for their case. So, to give some examples of the type of choices trustees might make, in the first case here, Scheme 1, the trustees have gone for 100% Irish sovereign annuity for all their pensioners. However, Scheme 2 in this case feels that there is perhaps too high risk a strategy for it to adopt. It wants a more conservative approach with some element of guarantee and some element of diversification. So the trustees under Scheme 2 here have chosen a conventional annuity to provide a guaranteed underpin for the pensioners up to a certain threshold level. They've decided in this case that 50% of all pensions up to a max of €30,000 per annum should be bought on a conventional basis. Above that then, they want diversification. So above that, pensions will be linked to 50% Irish sovereign bonds and 50% French sovereign bonds. This means in their conversations with the pensioners and with the members of the scheme, they can communicate that there still are guarantees and also that there's an element of diversification. I think the trend here, the change, is something that there's a growing acceptance that perhaps when it comes to scheme wind-up, a certain level of guarantee should be given to lower level of pensions, which is superior to the level of guarantee that should be given to higher level of pensions. The third alternative here is where trustees have decided to flip around sovereign annuities. So they may have gone through the process 1 or process 2 and made that decision. They then, say, come across some pensioners who are concerned still that there are a level of risks. The trustees, under these circumstances, could give these pensioners an option of conventional annuities. What they do is effectively work out the economic cost of the sovereign annuity under basis 1 or 2, and then present that economic cost to the pensioners in the form of conventional annuity. Naturally, the conventional annuity will be lesser in amount, maybe 20 or 15% lesser, but nevertheless, the pensioners then have the ability to make a choice as to which type of offering that they wanted to take for. I think one of the themes that's emerging with sovereign annuity is that while they do bring extra options and flexibility to trustees, and while people naturally like the idea of options and flexibilities, it also does bring a greater burden of decision making. Trustees now have to make much more active decisions about how they're going to allocate the limited funds within the pension fund, how they're going to fairly distribute that between different members. So how will trustees make these decisions? Well, I've spoken to a lot of trustees and employers over the last year or so as we were developing our product. I think it's fair to say that we found every trustee and every employer has a different view and different perspective on pensions, and they often simultaneously have 2 or 3 different views on sovereign annuities. The type of situations that will emerge, which will determine how decisions are made, depends upon whether the scheme is in a wind-up or whether it's an ongoing scheme which is considering sovereign annuities. Is it a buyout or a buy-in? Because there's different types of risk borne on different people under those different scenarios. I think the funding level of the scheme will be a crucial factor, and also the employer's view. It certainly would be agreed that in the event of wind-up with a poor level of funding, that sovereign annuities will be an agenda item for trustees. I think there's a general view also, employers will be slightly more enthusiastic about sovereign annuities than trustees who may be somewhat more reticent. So the employer's view and the level of contribution that the employer is making into the input and decision making on the pension fund will also have an influence as to whether sovereign annuities are highly on the agenda or not. The philosophy regards member class equity is essentially a fancy way of saying how do the trustees believe the funds within the scheme should fairly be distributed between pensioners and between active and deferred members. They will have active and tough decisions to make when it comes to those type of proposals. I think over time, trustees, as the product develops, will look to precedent, and they'll also look to some sort of external reference point. So David already made mention to the proposed €30,000 limit, and while we understand this is now currently on ice, that concept is out there, and trustees may get some comfort from making a decision around sovereign annuities and cut-off points with reference to those type of proposed limits. I think trustees will look for some sort of level of objectivity and external reference point to back up their decisions. So we've spoken about buy-in and buy-out. I think it's worth considering just a little bit more what the differences are between these. With a buy-in, the scheme buys the sovereign annuity essentially as an investment asset of the scheme. The trustees are making an investment decision, and no individual members are actually being directly affected by that decision at that point in time. With a buyout done under sovereign annuities or otherwise, there's a full discharge of liabilities. This means that the individual pensioners will have a policy with Irish Life, and they will no longer become a member of the scheme. So there is quite different levels of risk being borne here. One is the risk is on the pensioner side, and the other, the risk is within the scheme as a whole. A buy-in, because it can be done quite neatly behind the scenes without a great deal of pensioner involvement, whereas a buyout obviously does involve those pensioners because payroll and so on will change for them. Now, a buy-in does involve some level of communication to members that the trustees have done such a buy-in, and that it would be their intention in the event of a scheme wind-up to use sovereign annuities to secure pensions. So there is an onus of communication there, but it's nowhere near as major as it would be in the event of a buyout. Both buy-in and buyout do get full minimum funding standard relief. So the trustees do get to report on a cheap annuity basis, which means that they can report an increased level of funding within the scheme. I think a situation where buy-in might be quite appropriate would be a scheme which is under a lot of funding pressure and is under pressure to produce a Section 50. A Section 50 order is where the trustees reduce the benefits in the scheme because it's been chronically underfunded. By taking a sovereign annuity approach, the trustees get some breathing room, a bit of time and space for them not to have to execute a Section 50, and they can put in place some sort of path towards solvency over the longer term. Obviously, a buyout would be required on a scheme wind-up where the trustees are fully discharging their responsibilities. So when will sovereign annuities actually be used? There's a couple of scenarios where I think they're most likely to be used. The first scenario is in an event of wind-up of a scheme in significant deficit. So as David mentioned, the people are queuing up for petrol, and at the moment, all the pensioners get full first call of all the fuel that's left in the tanks. Sovereign annuities provide an ability for trustees to be able to make a more fair distribution of those assets, so that an active member who's contributing for 40 years in a scheme but is not yet retired will get a proper share of his resources that have been inputted into the scheme, rather than being left high and dry while the pensioners get full security. I think the second situation where we see sovereign annuities being most likely to be used is when the employer has been suffering 10 or 15 years of DB pain, and the employer is in a conversation with the trustees looking to propose decisive action in respect of the scheme. The type of situation we envisage here is an employer saying to the trustees that in response to sovereign annuities being used by the trustees as a way of addressing the funding of the scheme, the employer would be prepared to make a generous contribution to the scheme. The employer might see this as a painful once-off contribution, but at least it will take the view that from then on the scheme can be restructured in a more sensible way, and in a way that is more in line with its risk tolerances. Certainly a third option we see is a scheme which fundamentally the trustees and the employer believe has a future. It's going to be an ongoing live entity for some time, but it's currently struggling and facing into the possibility of a Section 50 painful benefit reduction. A sovereign annuity buy-in under those circumstances would give the trustees and the employer some time in order to get the scheme back on a more solvent track. This is the crucial slide that people often want to get to when I was having one-to-one presentations with trustees and consultants. It comes down to the pricing slide. This is the raw numbers and how it actually affects schemes. Firstly, it's important to note that when people talk about discounts in relation to sovereign annuities, what's the discount relative to? There are discounts for bulk schemes in the marketplace versus individual annuity pricing, which is largely due to the fact that there's much heavier mortality on the bulk side, and there's a strong anti-selection effect due to ARFs on the individual annuity market. So that discount varies case by case, but can be between 5 and 10%, depending on the profile of the scheme. So taking that as our starting point, our bulk starting discount, which is at those levels, the extra discount that's available for sovereign annuities depends obviously on which type of bonds are actually chosen. It depends upon the yield and the duration of those bonds. We've had conversations with the NTMA, and the NTMA have indicated that they would be willing to offer the longer, flatter bonds, which are a good match for annuities, to sovereign bonds, and a yield of about 6%. That 6% yield would generate, under current market conditions, a reduction of bulk annuity pricing of about 20% for an annuity which was 100% linked to Irish sovereign bonds. Alternatively, if the trustees decided they wanted to use the French sovereign annuity bond, that would reduce in about a 4% reduction in price. The reason for that, obviously, is that France currently has a bond yield which is significantly lower than Ireland, but it is a little bit higher than Germany, so there is that differential coming through. So this really is a risk-return decision the trustees have to make. On the one hand, Ireland is perceived by rating agencies, by the market, as being a higher risk than France, so the yield is higher, but then the pricing reduction is more significant. Another alternative for trustees, separate to sovereign annuities but a linked concept, is that of sovereign bonds. Sovereign bonds originate at the same time as sovereign annuities, and the idea behind sovereign bonds is that larger schemes, which haven't traditionally bought annuities, should be able to directly access these type of sovereign bonds and to get the funding standard relief that is available for them. I think it's fair to say, having some conversation with people within the industry over the last week or so, that the level of certainty around sovereign bonds is highly unclear, that there still is an awful lot of technical work to be done to see exactly how these sovereign bonds will work. The principles of them, however, is that a large scheme should be able to invest, or any scheme should be able to invest directly in sovereign bonds and get the same sort of funding standard relief as they would if they'd bought into sovereign annuities. So the advantages are relief from the funding standard, potential version of a Section 50. The scheme doesn't have to pay for longevity protection if it doesn't want to pay for longevity protection. And also, it'll be similar to a buy-in, that the risk is not launched onto the pensioners, but rather it's held by the trustees and the scheme as a whole. However, some of the disadvantages of this is this an investment decision that the trustees would have made objectively, assessing the relative merits of the assets? Is the yield on offer good enough for the risk that's implicit within the bonds? And also, are the assets liquid? The assets being liquid is not really an issue for the insurance company when offering annuities, because we buy the assets to hold them for the whole duration of the annuity. However, with a fund, if it does make a decision to buy sovereign bonds, will it subsequently have to liquidate those assets in the event of a future event, and what sort of pricing will it get for them? We've had a mention already of a parachute, and I'm just going to talk to you very briefly about what is a contingent asset. This is another form of parachute. We see this as a sort of modified form of guarantee. We see this being available for larger, more sophisticated schemes where there's an ongoing consultation process between the employer and the trustees in relation to the future of the scheme and the possibility of sovereign annuities. The employer might be quite enthusiastic about sovereign annuities, but the trustees, reasonably enough, are somewhat more reticent. And as a result, the employer could propose that it makes available a contingent asset to the trustees, that in the event the trustees do purchase sovereign annuities and that there is some restructuring or default event, the value of that contingent asset will become available to the trustees to make good any shortfall that they experience as a result of the sovereign annuity default. This is something which we think some larger schemes will consider, but it won't be appropriate for all. So what are the next steps? Well, the next steps are for Irish Life to finalise our certification process with the Pensions Board. That should be ongoing, and as a result, we expect the product to be launched by the middle of May. However, it is important to note that we are open for conversation with schemes today. From past experience, even conventional annuity buyouts can take 3 to 4 months to execute, even at the best of times. So it is important that trustees and employers start to think about their options now and start to have those conversations today so that they are prepared for what is coming down the line. I think we would recognise that there is a need for further clarity from the Pensions Board in relation to minimum funding standards before trustees are likely to make any final decisions. Trustees, as rational human beings, will want to see the full set of choices that they have available to them before they make binding decisions which they can't back out of. However, it's fair to say that certainly sovereign annuities will be a compulsory agenda item in the coming years for many scheme sponsors and trustees because of the level of flexibility and options that they now bring to the industry. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we've come full circle. We come back to the prince that we started our voyage with. I presented you with the evidence and you were the jury. Over the next year or two, by your decisions, you'll make a decision as to whether it is that this prince is a force for good or a force for ill in our world. Thank you.